The chains around Goliath Stoneheart's wrists had frozen solid, the iron biting deeper into his flesh with each gust of wind that howled across the Colorado mountain pass. Snow swirled around his massive frame, 7 feet of muscle and bone, that his former master had deemed too expensive to feed through another winter. The slavers had left him chained to a dead pine tree 3 hours ago, taking his warmth, his hope, and his will to fight. But not his life. Not yet, through the white curtain of the blizzard. He saw her, a figure in expensive furs, riding a black stallion. Her face set with grim determination as she guided her mount through the treacherous drifts. Most people would have taken shelter hours ago. Most people weren't Evangeline Ashworth, widow of the richest mine owner in Silverfall Territory. And most people didn't make it their business to travel impossible roads in impossible weather. Sweet Mother of God, she breathed, pulling her horse to a stop 20 feet from where Goliath hung against the tree. Even through the storm, she could see the chains, the blood. The way his massive chest still rose and fell, despite everything that should have killed him by now. Goliath lifted his head, his crystals falling from his dark beard like broken diamonds. His eyes, pale blue against his weathered skin, met hers across the distance. And something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Recognition, not of faces, but of souls that had known suffering. "You're alive," she said, dismounting with practiced grace despite the ankle-deep snow. "For now," he replied, his voice a rumble that somehow carried over the wind. "You should keep riding, ma'am. Storm's getting worse." "So I see." Evangeline pulled a set of bolt cutters from her saddlebag stools she'd learned to carry after many encounters with the territory's casual cruelties. "Good thing I don't take orders from dying men." The first chain snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Goliath's left arm fell free, blood immediately beginning to flow where the iron had cut deep. He flexed his fingers, wincing as feeling returned in painful waves. "Why?" he asked as she worked on the second chain. "Because no one deserves to die like this." The second chain parted, and Goliath staggered forward, catching himself against the tree. "Because I've seen too much injustice in these mountains. To ignore another piece of it, you don't know me, don't know what I might have done." Evangeline looked up at him, this giant of a man who could have crushed her with one hand but was warning her away instead of threatening her. In his eyes she saw something she recognized from her own mirror, the weight of choices made by others, of a life shaped by circumstances beyond control. "I know you thanked me for cutting you free instead of demanding it," she said. "I know you're worried about my safety in a blizzard instead of your own survival. That tells me what I need to know about your character." Goliath tried to stand, straight, and nearly collapsed. The cold had sapped more strength than he'd realized, and the blood loss from his wrists wasn't helping. Evangeline caught his arm more, her hands barely wrapped around his forearm. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Can you get us both out of here alive if I can't?" No. Her honesty was as sharp as the wind. "But I'm not leaving you to die, so we'd better figure something out." Goliath looked at this small, fierce woman who'd appeared out of the storm like an angel of mercy and felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for years. Hope, maybe. Or just the stubborn refusal to let someone else's kindness go to waste. "Help me up," he said. Getting a 7-foot man onto a horse designed for normal-sized riders proved nearly impossible. But desperation made them creative. Evangeline used her rope to create a makeshift stirrup. In between her pulling and his determination, they managed to get him seated behind her saddle. "Hold on," she said as the stallion shifted nervously under the double load. Goliath's arms wrapped around her waist, and even through the thick furs, Evangeline could feel the raw power in his frame. But his grip was gentle, protective rather than possessive. Another sign that her instincts about his character had been correct. "Where are we going?" he asked, as she turned the horse toward what looked like solid wall of white. "Home," she said. "Simply, my home. You need warmth, food, and medical attention. In that order. People will talk. People always talk." Evangeline urged the stallion forward into the storm. "Let them. I stopped caring about gossip the day I buried my husband." Yes. They rode deeper into the blizzard. Neither of them spoke about the obvious complications ahead. A wealthy white widow bringing a freed black giant to her estate would cause more than gossip. It would cause scandal, possibly violence. But the storm was thinking for them now, reducing their world to the next 100 yards of survival. Behind them, the broken chains lay buried in the snow, and with them the last remnants of Goliath Stoneheart's life as property. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous and full of possibility in equal measure. "What's your name?" Evangeline called over the wind. Goliath Stoneheart." "I'm Evangeline Ashworth." "And Goliath, yes ma'am." "When we get to my house, you're not my guest. You're not my employee. You're a free man who needed help, and I was in a position to give it. Remember that, when the questions start?" Goliath tightened his grip slightly, feeling tears freeze on his cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes, ma'am. I'll remember." The storm raged around them, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt truly alone. The Ashworth estate materialized out of the blizzard, like a vision from a fever dream. 3 stories of Colorado stone and timber, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and golden light spilling from frost-covered windows. Even half frozen and exhausted, Goliath could see the wealth that had built this place: the wrought-iron gates, the circular drive, the carriage house that was larger than most family homes. Impressive, he managed through chattering teeth. "Husband's legacy," Evangeline replied, though something in her tone suggested the legacy was complicated. "He built it to prove something to people who were never going to accept him anyway." The front door burst open before they'd fully stopped, revealing a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a face that spoke of authority earned through years of managing an impossible household. Mrs. Ashworth. The woman, clearly the head of staff, rushed down the steps despite the driving snow. "We've been worried sick. The storm hit so fast. And when you didn't return from town..." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Goliath's massive form behind her mistress. Her eyes widened, taking in his size, his color, the blood on his wrists. But to her credit, she recovered quickly. "Mrs. Brisbane," Evangeline said, dismounting with obvious relief. "Now, this is Mr. Stoneheart. He needs immediate medical attention and shelter from the storm." "Of course, ma'am." Brisbane moved to help Goliath down from the horse, though it was like a sparrow trying to assist an eagle. "Should I prepare the guest room?" "The blue room," Evangeline said firmly. "It has the largest bed and the best view of the mountains." Brisbane's eyebrows rose fractionally. The blue room was reserved for the most honored guests, but she simply nodded. "I'll have it warmed immediately." "And Dr. Meridian?" "Send for him as soon as the roads are passable. In the meantime, bring hot water, clean bandages, and some of those herbal poultices for wounds." As they helped Goliath into the house, he found himself surrounded by luxury he'd never imagined. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over furniture that probably cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. "This way, sir," Brisbane said, leading him toward a grand staircase. "Mind the 3rd step? Creak something fierce." The blue room proved to be larger than any space Goliath had ever occupied as a free man. A 4-poster bed dominated one wall, while a fireplace crackled cheerfully on the other. French doors led to a balcony that would offer spectacular mountain views once the storm passed. "I'll have hot water up in a moment," Brisbane said, bustling around the room with practiced efficiency. "There are clean clothes in the wardrobe, mister." Ashworth was a large man, though perhaps not quite as substantial as yourself. Evangeline appeared in the doorway carrying a medical kit that looked like it could supply a small hospital. "Mrs. Brisbane, would you see that Mr. Stoneheart has whatever he needs? Food, drink, anything at all?" "Of course, ma'am." Brisbane paused at the door. "And ma'am?" "The staff will have questions. Tell them Mr. Stoneheart is my guest, for as long as he chooses to stay. Anyone with a problem can discuss it with me directly." After Brisbane left, Evangeline approached Goliath, who was standing uncertainly in the middle of the opulent room, like a mountain trying to fit into a jewelry box. "Sit," she said gently, gesturing to a chair by the fire. "Let me look at those wrists." "You don't have to sit." This time it was an order, delivered with the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "You're bleeding on my Persian rug." Goliath sat, and immediately the chair creaked ominously under his weight. Evangeline knelt beside him, her small hands incredibly gentle as she examined the wounds the chains had left. "Deep but clean," she murmured, opening her medical kit. "The cold probably saved you from infection. This will sting. Antiseptic." Burned like liquid fire, but Goliath didn't flinch. He'd endured worse, much worse, and the pain was almost welcome proof that he was alive, that he was free. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her work with professional competence. "My husband was in the mining business. Accidents were common, doctors were scarce, and I learned early that squeamishness was a luxury I couldn't afford." She began wrapping his wrists with clean bandages. "Ow. What happened to you, Goliath? How did you end up chained to a tree in a blizzard?" The question he'd been dreading. Goliath looked into the fire, watching the flames dance while he decided how much truth this woman could handle. "I was property," he said finally. "Belonged to a man named Brockus Grimm, who owned a logging operation up north. Good worker, never gave trouble, but winter came early and food got scarce. Grimm decided it was cheaper to let me die than feed me through the cold months. So he just... left you, told his men I'd tried to escape. Said I was dangerous, couldn't be trusted. They chained me up and rode away." Goliath's voice was steady, but Evangeline could hear the old pain underneath. "Been property most of my life, ma'am. Born into it, sold out of it, bought back into it. Yesterday was the first time anyone ever chose to cut my chains instead of tighten them." Evangeline finished bandaging his wrists and sat back on her heels. Studying his face in the firelight, "You're free now. Completely free. The law may be slow to catch up to reality in these territories, but it will. And until it does, you're under my protection." "Why?" The question came out rougher than he'd intended. "Why risk your reputation? You're standing in the community for someone like me." Evangeline stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm that still raged beyond the glass. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "Because 20 years ago, I was the one who needed saving, and someone stepped forward when they didn't have to. My husband found me half dead on his doorstep, running from people who would have killed me for the crime of loving the wrong man. He could have turned me away, protected his own interests. Instead, he gave me a name, a home, and a chance at a different life." She turned back to face him. "He died 3 years ago, and I've been looking for a way to pay forward the kindness he showed me. Today I found it. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them all in the estate while the outside world disappeared beneath 8 feet of snow. Goliath spent those days healing, both physically and in ways he hadn't expected. The wounds on his wrists closed cleanly under Evangeline's careful attention. But more importantly, the wounds in his spirit began to show signs of mending. He'd never lived in luxury before, never experienced the simple dignity of being treated as a guest. Rather than property, Mrs. Brisbane and the staff had accepted his presence with minimal fuss, following their mistress's lead in treating him with the respect due any visitor. The cook, a motherly woman named Cordelia, had taken it as a personal challenge to put weight back on his massive frame. "You're too thin," she declared, setting down a breakfast tray that could have fed 3 normal men. "All muscle and bone, like you've been starved half to death." "Close enough," Goliath replied, attacking the eggs and bacon with appropriate appreciation. "This is the finest food I've ever tasted, Miss Cordelia. Just Cordelia, honey. And you eat every bit of it. Mrs. Ashworth wants you strong, and I aim to see you get there." It was on the 3rd morning that Dr. Meridian finally arrived, having made the treacherous journey from town on snowshoes. He was a small, precise man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he examined Goliath's healing wounds with professional thoroughness. "Excellent work," he told Evangeline, who had assisted with the examination. "Clean, properly dressed, showing no signs of infection. You missed your calling as a physician." "I had a good teacher," she replied. "Will there be any permanent damage?" "Some. Scarring, but nothing that will impair function. Your patient is remarkably resilient." Dr. Meridian packed his instruments carefully. "Though I confess, Mrs. Ashworth, I'm curious about the circumstances that brought Mr. Stoneheart to your care." Evangeline exchanged a glance with Goliath, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed what to tell people, settling on a version of the truth that would minimize scandal while establishing his status as a free man. "I found him injured on the mountain road during the storm," she said. "Apparently he'd been set upon by bandits and left for dead. I couldn't leave him to freeze." Dr. Meridian accepted this explanation without visible skepticism.
Ow.
Though Goliath suspected the man was too intelligent to believe it completely, still, frontier doctors learned early not to ask too many questions about their patient's circumstances. "Well, whatever happened, he's fortunate you found him," the doctor said, preparing to leave. A few more hours in that storm would have been fatal. After Dr. Meridian left, Evangeline found Goliath in the estate's library, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. He was sitting in a chair by the window, a book open in his massive hands, looking incongruously delicate as he turned the pages. "You can read," she observed, not really surprised. "My first master's wife taught me," Goliath said without looking up from the book, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. Said it was a sin for any man to live without literature regardless of his station. She was a good woman, died young. What happened to her? Influenza. Winter of '67. Her husband sold me the next spring. Said I reminded him too much of her kindness. Goliath closed the book gently. "I've missed this. Books. The way words can take you somewhere else, make you someone else, even if it's just for a few hours." Evangeline settled into the chair across from him, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the windows highlighted the silver threads in his dark hair. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 42 or 45, but his eyes held the accumulated weight of experiences that aged a man beyond his years. "You're welcome to any book in this collection," she said. "My husband was a voracious reader. Said knowledge was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen. Thank you." Goliath hesitated, then set the book aside. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something. And I need you to give me an honest answer, of course. The storm's breaking up. Roads will be passable soon. People in town will start asking questions about the giant black man living in the Ashworth mansion. Your reputation, your standing. In the community, it's all going to be at risk because of me." Evangeline had been expecting this conversation, dreading it and anticipating it in equal measure. "What's your question, Goliath? Are you asking me to leave?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address. Evangeline stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds where the storm's fury was finally beginning to abate. "No," she said finally, "I'm not asking you to leave, but I am asking if you want to stay. What's the difference?" She turned back to face him, and he saw something in her dark eyes that made his breath catch. "The difference is choice. The difference is agency. The difference is whether you're here because you have nowhere else to go, or because you want to be here." Goliath stood slowly, his impressive height making the already large room seem suddenly intimate. "And if I want to stay? What then? Then we figure out how to build a life that makes sense for both of us. You're educated, you're strong, you understand hard work. There are opportunities here managing the mining operations, overseeing the ranch hands, dozens of ways you could make a real contribution. As your employee, as my partner." The words came out before she could stop them, surprising them both with their honesty. "I've been running this empire alone for 3 years, Goliath. It's profitable, but it's lonely. I could use someone I trust to help carry the load, partner." He tested the word like he was trying on clothes that might not fit. People would assume what people always assume when they see a man and a woman working together. Let them. Evangeline moved closer, close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "I learned long ago that living your life according to other people's expectations is just another form of slavery." Goliath reached out slowly, his massive hand cupping her face with incredible gentleness. "You saved my life, Evangeline. Won't repay that kindness by destroying your reputation." "My reputation survived marrying a man 20 years my senior for money instead of love. It survived being childless in a territory that judges women by their fertility. It survived 3 years of running a business in a world that thinks women are decorative rather than functional." She covered his hand with both of hers. "I think it can survive one more scandal, and if it can't, then we'll build something new together somewhere else. The world is wide, Goliath, and there are places where the color of a man's skin matters. less than the content of his character. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were breaking up, revealing patches of blue sky and the promise of clearing weather. Soon, the outside world would intrude on the sanctuary they'd built together over 3 days of enforced isolation. But for now, in the quiet of the library, with afternoon sunlight streaming across the Persian carpets, two people who had found each other in a blizzard began to imagine what their shared future might look like. News of the giant living at the Ashworth estate spread through Silverfall like wildfire through dry timber. By the time the roads were fully passable, half the territory was buzzing with speculation about Evangeline's mysterious house guest and what his presence meant for the community's social order. The first official visitor was Mayor Cornelius Blackthorne, a pompous man whose political ambitions were matched only by his capacity for moral outrage when it served his purposes. He arrived with 2 town councilmen in tow, their faces set with the grim determination of men prepared to do their civic duty. Evangeline received them in the estate's formal parlor, with Goliath standing quietly by the fireplace. His mere presence seemed to shrink the room, making the mayor and his companions visibly uncomfortable. As they perched on the edges of their chairs like birds ready to take flight, "Mrs. Ashworth," Mayor Blackthorne began, his voice carrying the weight of official concern. "The town council has received numerous reports about your house guest. Naturally, we're concerned about the implications for community safety and social stability." "Naturally," Evangeline replied, her tone perfectly polite and completely unimpressed. "Though I'm curious about what implications you're referring to, Mr. Stoneheart. It's been nothing but a gentleman during his stay." "That may be," Councilman Porter interjected, "but surely you understand the irregularity of the situation. Woman of your standing, harboring a man of his background. His background as a victim of violence who needed medical attention?" Evangeline's voice carried the sharp edge that had once intimidated mining foremen twice her size. "I wasn't aware that Christian charity had become a regular in our community." Mayor Blackthorne cleared his throat importantly. "Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps we could speak privately? Anything you need to say can be said in Mr. Stoneheart's presence." She cut him off. "After all, he's the subject of your concern." Goliath stepped forward slightly, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that managed to be both respectful and subtly intimidating. "Gentlemen, if you have questions about my character or intentions, I'm happy to address them directly." The 3 officials exchanged nervous glances. They'd clearly expected to deal with a subservient former slave, not an articulate man who spoke like an educated equal. "We've heard disturbing reports," Councilman Hayes said finally, "about your previous circumstances. Some say you were involved with logging operations up north, that there were incidents." "There were incidents," Goliath agreed calmly. "I was held against my will, forced to work without compensation, and ultimately left to die when I became inconvenient. If that disturbs you, gentlemen, then we're in agreement." Mayor Blackthorne's face reddened. "That's not what we meant, and you know it. There are rumors about violence. It's about you being dangerous. The only violence I've participated in was defending myself against men who would have killed me for sport." Goliath's voice remained level, but something in his eyes made the 3 visitors shift uncomfortably. "As for being dangerous, I suppose that depends on whether you consider literacy, hard work, and Christian morality to be threats to your community." Evangeline hid a smile behind her teacup. She'd seen this side of Goliath emerging over the past. Weak the man who had refused to be broken by slavery, who had somehow maintained his dignity and intelligence despite years of systematic dehumanization. "The truth is, gentlemen," she said, setting down her cup with decisive clink, "Mr. Stoneheart has proven himself to be exactly the kind of citizen this territory needs. He's educated, industrious, and possessed of a moral character that puts many of our established residents to shame." "That's all well and good," Mayor Blackthorne said, "but you must understand the position this puts the community in. People are talking, making assumptions about what exactly?" Evangeline stood, her petite frame somehow commanding the room despite being dwarfed by every man present. "About the fact that I've offered hospitality to a man in need? About the fact that I refuse to judge people by the color of their skin? rather than the content of their character. About the impropriety of an unmarried woman cohabitating with a man of questionable background, Councilman Porter said bluntly. The words hung in the air like a slap. Evangeline felt her temper rise, but before she could respond, Goliath spoke. Then, perhaps, he said quietly, it's time we addressed that concern directly. He turned to face Evangeline, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. Evangeline, I've been thinking about what you said. About partnerships, about building something together, about not living your life according to other people's expectations. Goliath, these gentlemen are concerned about propriety, about assumptions and implications and social stability. He moved closer to her, his massive presence somehow protective rather than overwhelming. There's a simple solution to their concerns. Mayor Blackthorne and his companions watched in fascination and growing alarm as Goliath slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with Evangeline's. Evangeline Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? But the proposal was so unexpected, so perfectly timed to address their visitors' complaints while simultaneously shocking them into speechlessness. That Evangeline almost laughed, but then she looked into Goliath's eyes and saw something there that stopped her breath. This wasn't just a strategic maneuver to silence criticism. This was a man laying his heart bare in front of witnesses, offering her everything he had to give. Yes, she said softly, then louder. Yes, Goliath, I will marry you. The parlor erupted in chaos. Mayor Blackthorne sputtered protests about the impropriety of mixed-race marriages, while the councilmen alternated between congratulations that sounded like condolences and warnings about the social consequences of such a union. But Evangeline heard none of it. She was too busy looking into the eyes of the man who had just solved all their problems by creating entirely new ones, and realizing that she had never been happier to face an uncertain future. Well, gentlemen, she said as Goliath rose and took her hand, I believe your concerns about propriety have been addressed. Mr. Stoneheart will no longer be my house guest. He'll be my husband. As the officials fled in confusion and dismay, Evangeline and Goliath stood together in the parlor, hands clasped, facing whatever storm their announcement would bring. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly. Are you? Never been more sure of anything in my life, and we'll weather whatever comes together, she said, squeezing his hand. After all, we survived a blizzard. Much worse can social disapproval be. We're about to find out. The news of their engagement spread faster than any blizzard ever could, reaching every corner of Silverfall territory within 48 hours. The reactions ranged from shock to outrage to the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters. Some of the town's more progressive citizens offered cautious congratulations, while others made their disapproval known through pointed snubs and anonymous letters. The Methodist minister refused to perform the ceremony, as did the Baptist preacher and the Catholic priest. By the third day, it seemed as though their wedding plans might be indefinitely postponed by lack of an officiant. That was when Father Miguel O'Brien arrived. The elderly Irish priest had spent 30 years ministering to mining camps and frontier settlements, performing marriages, baptisms, and last rites for anyone who asked, regardless of their race, nationality, or social standing. He'd heard about the controversy in Silverfall and had ridden 2 days through mountain passes to offer his services. I've married Chinese to Irish, Mexican to German, in every combination you can imagine, he told them over dinner at the estate. In God's eyes, love is love, and any priest who says otherwise has forgotten what gospel he's supposed to be preaching. There will be consequences for you, Evangeline warned. The church hierarchy doesn't look kindly on controversial marriages. Father O'Brien's laugh was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Child, I'm 73 years old, and I've been disciplined by the church more times than I can count. At my age, the worst they can do is send me somewhere with better weather. With the officiant secured, they began planning a ceremony that would be both intimate and public, intimate enough to feel personal, public enough to make their union, official in the eyes of the community that would have to accept it. But 3 days before the wedding, trouble arrived in the form of Brockus Grimm. Evangeline was in town arranging for flowers when she heard the commotion from the saloon raised. Voices, the sound of furniture breaking, and underneath it all, a voice she'd learned to recognize even at a distance. She hurried toward the noise, pushing through the crowd that had gathered outside the establishment. Inside, she found Goliath standing with his back to the bar, facing down 5 men, led by a stocky, bearded brute whose eyes held the particular cruelty of someone accustomed to owning other human beings. "There's my property," Brockus Grimm was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged. "Thought you were dead, boy. Shows how hard it is to kill a good workhorse." "I'm not your property," Goliath replied. Calmly, though, Evangeline could see the tension in his shoulders. "Haven't been for days now. That's where you're wrong." Grimm pulled a rolled paper from his coat. "Got the bill of sale right here? Bought and paid for? Signed and sealed? You belong to me until I decide otherwise?" "Those papers aren't worth the ink they're printed with," came a new voice from the saloon's entrance. Marshal Jake Morrison stepped into the room, his badge glinting in the lamplight and his hand resting casually on his gun. "Slavery's been abolished in this territory for 5 years, Grimm. You know that as well as anyone." "This isn't about slavery," Grimm protested. "This is about a legal contract for indentured servitude. Completely different thing." "Show me the contract," the marshal said. Grimm hesitated, then handed over the papers. Marshal Morrison examined them carefully, his experienced eyes noting details that would have escaped most observers. "Interesting document," he said finally, "especially the date. According to this, you purchased Mr. Stonehart's services in 1871, but according to territorial law, all such contracts became null and void in 1870. This paper isn't just worthless, it's evidence of illegal activity." The color drained from Grimm's face. "Now see here, no. You see here?" The marshal's voice carried the authority of 15 years in frontier law enforcement. "You just admitted to holding a man against his will for years after it became illegal to do so. That's kidnapping, false imprisonment, and a few other charges I can think of. You want to press your claim? We can discuss it in front of a territorial judge." Grimm looked around the saloon, searching for support among the faces that stared back at him. But even in a community struggling with racial prejudice, there were limits to what decent people would tolerate. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice carrying more bluster than conviction. "Yes, it is," Goliath said quietly. "I'm a free man, getting married in 3 days to a woman who loves me. You have no power over me anymore, Grimm. You never did, really. You just convinced me that you did." Evangeline watched her future husband face down the man who had enslaved him and felt her heart swell with pride. This was the man she was choosing to spend her life with, someone who had maintained his dignity and strength through experiences that would have broken lesser souls. Grimm and his men left without further incident, but not before the logger made it clear that he considered the matter far from settled. As the crowd dispersed, Evangeline found herself alone with Goliath and the marshal. "Thank you," she said to Morrison. "Your timing was perfect." "Wasn't timing," the marshal replied with a slight smile. "I've been keeping an eye on things since. Word got around about your engagement. Figured Grimm might show up eventually. Men like him don't give up easy." "Will he be back?" Goliath asked. "Probably. But next time, he'll be breaking territorial law if he tries anything. That puts him in my jurisdiction, and I take a dim view of people who think they can own other people." As they walked home together, Evangeline slipped her arm through Goliath's, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "Having second thoughts?" she asked lightly. "About marrying you, neighbor?" He covered her hand with his. "About the wisdom of doing it so publicly, with so many people watching for us to fail, every day. Good thing I'm not marrying you for your wisdom, then. What are you marrying me for?" Evangeline considered the question as they walked up the hill toward the estate, their footsteps crunching in the snow that still lined the roads. "For the way you thanked me for cutting your chains instead of demanding it," she said finally. "For the way you read Shakespeare like it was written just for you. For the way you proposed in front of 3 men who were trying to shame us both and somehow turned their disapproval into our triumph. And because 3 days ago, when you could have said you wanted to stay because you had nowhere else to go. You said you wanted to stay because you wanted to be here with me." Goliath stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with the same gentle strength she'd come to associate with everything he did. "Evangeline," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I spent 40 years believing I was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay for me. You taught me that a man's worth isn't measured in dollars or chains or bills of sale. It's measured in the choices he makes when he's free to make them. And what choice are you making? Choosing to love you. Not because you saved me, not because I owe you, but because you saw something in me worth saving when I'd forgotten it existed myself." Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They turned to see Mrs. Brisbane riding up the hill on one of the estate's horses, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Mrs. Ashworth," she called out as she approached. "Thank goodness you're safe. Dare spin news from town. 3 more men arrived asking about Mr. Stoneheart. They claim to be bounty hunters." The bounty hunters proved to be a different breed of trouble than Brockus Grimm, where Grimm had been bluster and barely legal intimidation. These 3 were professionals, cold-eyed men, made their living tracking down people who didn't want to be found. Their leader, a scarred man named Silas Crane, presented himself at the estate the next morning with all the courtesy of a snake oil salesman and twice the menace. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, touching the brim of his hat as she received him in the parlor, "I do apologize for the intrusion. My associates and I are here on behalf of Mr. Brockus Grimm, who has concerns about a piece of his missing property." "Mr. Stoneheart is not property," Evangeline replied coolly. "He's my fiancé and a free man under territorial law." "Well, now, that's where things get complicated." Crane pulled out a different set of papers, newer, more official looking. "See, Mr. Grimm has filed a complaint with the territorial government claiming theft of property. Till that complaint is resolved, we have a legal writ to detain the individual in question." Goliath, who had been standing quietly by the window, stepped forward. "Let me see those papers." Crane hesitated, clearly not expecting a former slave to demand legal documentation, but under Evangeline's withering stare, he handed over the writ. Goliath examined the papers with the careful attention of a man who had learned that details mattered when your freedom hung in the balance. After several minutes, he looked up with something that might have been relief. "These papers are dated 3 days ago," he said. "They reference a law that was repealed last year. Whoever drew up this writ didn't do their homework." "That's a mighty convenient claim," Crane said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "But I don't take legal advice from educated men who know how to read." Evangeline's voice could have cut glass. "Mr. Stoneheart happens to be better versed in territorial law than most of the clerks who work for the government. Says your writ is invalid? I suggest you get a second opinion from someone with actual authority." "Ma'am, with all due respect, we didn't ride all this way to argue legal technicalities. We've got a job to do, and we aim to do it." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. These men hadn't come to debate law. They'd come to take Goliath by force if necessary, trusting that a remote estate in the mountains wouldn't attract too much official attention. That was when they discovered their first mistake. "Gentlemen," came a voice from the parlor entrance, "I'm afraid there's been a development in your case." Marshal Morrison stepped into the room, followed by 2 deputies and a man in expensive clothes who carried himself with the authority of high office. Territorial Judge Harrison Morrison announced, "He's here to address Mr. Grimm's complaint personally." Judge Harrison was a tall, dignified man with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He examined Crane's papers with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades interpreting territorial law. "Interesting document," he said finally. "Unfortunately, it references statutes that were declared unconstitutional last spring. This writ has no legal standing whatsoever." "But Mr. Grimm said Mr. Grimm is currently in territorial custody." The judge interrupted smoothly. "It seems that attempting to file false legal documents is considered fraud in this jurisdiction. He'll be facing trial next month." Crane and his associates exchanged glances, clearly calculating whether their fee was worth the risk of challenging a territorial judge directly. "Now then," Judge Harrison continued, "I understand there's to be a wedding here tomorrow. Congratulations to the happy couple." "Thank you, Your Honor," Evangeline said, but she was still trying to process how quickly the situation had changed. took the liberty of reviewing the relevant laws regarding marriage in this territory, the judge said. Everything appears to be in perfect order. Father O'Brien's credentials are impeccable. The license is properly filed. Both parties are consenting adults of sound mind. He turned to address Crane directly. I trust there won't be any further misunderstandings about Mr. Stonehart's legal status? No, sir, Crane said reluctantly. Appears we were given bad information. Appears so. Suggest you gentlemen find your way back to wherever you came from, quickly. After the bounty hunters left with considerably less swagger than they'd arrived with, Judge Harrison accepted Evangeline's invitation to stay for dinner. I have to ask, Goliath said over the meal, what brought you here so quickly? Marshal Morrison's message couldn't have reached you more than yesterday. It didn't, the judge replied with a slight smile. I've been in the territory for a week, investigating reports of illegal labor practices in the mining camps. When I heard about your situation, I thought it might be connected to my investigation. And was it? Yes. Brockus Grimm has been running an illegal operation for years, using fraudulent contracts to keep workers in conditions that amount to slavery. Your case gave us the evidence we needed to shut him down permanently. Evangeline felt a chill of realization. We could have been killed if you hadn't arrived when you did, but we did arrive, Marshal Morrison said gently. Sometimes justice is a matter of timing as much as law. Besides, Judge Harrison added, from what I've observed, you two are quite capable of taking care of yourselves. The way you handled those bounty hunters, turning their own legal ignorance against them, that was impressive. That evening, as they walked through the estate's snow-covered gardens, Evangeline and Goliath reflected on how quickly their lives had changed. 24 hours ago, we were facing bounty hunters and illegal writs, she said. Now we're having dinner with territorial judges and planning our wedding. The frontier's like that, Goliath replied. Everything can change in a heartbeat for better or worse. Are you nervous? About tomorrow, terrified, he admitted. Not about marrying you, that's the easiest decision I've ever made. But about everything that comes after. Building a life together, facing whatever challenges come next. Proving to ourselves and everyone else that this isn't just a romantic gesture, but something real and lasting. Evangeline stopped walking and turned to face him, her hands finding his in the moonlight. It's Goliath. What we have isn't a romantic gesture. It's two people who found each other in a blizzard and decided to face whatever comes next together. That's not romance, that's partnership. That's the kind of love that builds something lasting. And if people don't accept us, if the business suffers, if we lose everything, then we'll build something new somewhere else. Together, she reached up to touch his face. I didn't fall in love with your reputation or your social standing. I fell in love with the man who thanked me for cutting his chains, who read Shakespeare by firelight, who proposed marriage to solve 3 problems at once and somehow made it the most romantic moment of my life. Goliath laughed, the sound carrying across the still mountain air. When you put it like that, it sounds almost reasonable. Almost reasonable is the best anyone can hope for in this life, Evangeline said, pulling him down for a kiss. Everything else is just adventure. Tomorrow would bring their wedding, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. But tonight, under the Colorado stars, 2 people who had saved each other from different kinds of storms held each other close and prepared to face whatever adventures awaited them. The wedding dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming across, fresh snow, and turning the mountain peaks into crystal spires against the blue sky. Despite the social controversy surrounding their union, nearly 200 people gathered at the estates, some drawn by curiosity, others by genuine affection for the couple, and a few by the simple desire to witness something unprecedented. In their quiet territory, Evangeline wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit and updated with modern touches that somehow managed to be both elegant and practical. Goliath had been fitted with a suit specially tailored to his massive frame-deep blue wool that brought out his eyes and made him look less like a giant and more like a man who happened to be extraordinarily tall. Father O'Brien officiated with the kind of joy that suggested he considered controversial weddings to be among life's greatest pleasures. Judge Harrison served as the official witness, while Mrs. Brisbane wept openly from the front row, her handkerchief working overtime. "Dearly beloved Father O'Brien," began, his Irish accent giving extra warmth to the familiar words, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and this community to witness the joining of two hearts that have already proven their commitment to each other through trial and adversity." The ceremony proceeded without incident until the moment when Father O'Brien asked if anyone knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage. A murmur ran through the crowd as people turned to look at each other, but no one spoke up. Then, by the power vested in me by the territorial government and the grace of Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The priest beamed at them both. "Goliath, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was tender and fierce at the same time, a promise sealed in front of witnesses who would carry the story of this day for decades to come. When they broke apart, the applause was thunderous, whatever reservations people might have had about the marriage. No one could deny the obvious love between the couple. The reception that followed was held in the estate's great hall, with tables groaning under the weight of food prepared by half the territory's best cooks. Music filled the air as the local musicians set aside their prejudices in favor of their fee. And even the most skeptical guests found themselves caught up in the celebration. It was during the dancing that the final test of their union's acceptance came. Young Timothy Chen, son of the local mercantile owner, approached Goliath with the wide-eyed curiosity of a 12-year-old who had never seen anyone quite so large. "Mr. Stoneheart," he said, craning his neck to look up at the giant, "is it true you can lift a full-grown horse?" "Timothy," his mother scolded, hurrying over, "don't bother Mr. Stoneheart with such nonsense." But Goliath knelt down to the boy's level, bringing his enormous frame into a more manageable perspective. "Never tried to lift a horse, Timothy, but I bet I could teach you to do something even more impressive." "Like what?" "Like reading. Your mother tells me you're struggling with your letters. Reading is a kind of strength that makes a man bigger than any muscle could." Timothy's eyes lit up with interest, and soon Goliath was surrounded by a cluster of children, all eager to hear stories from the giant who could read Shakespeare and do arithmetic in his head. Watching from across the room, Evangeline felt her heart swell with pride and love. This was the man she'd married, someone who instinctively knew that the way to win over a community was through its children, who understood that true strength lay in lifting others up rather than dominating them. As the evening wore on, more and more of the guests found reasons to approach the newlyweds. Some came with congratulations, others with business propositions, and a few with the kind of grudging respect that frontier communities reserve for those who prove themselves through action rather than words. "You've given this territory something to think about," Judge Harrison told them during a quiet moment between toasts, whether they admit it or not. "Everyone here has learned something tonight about the difference between what's legal and what's right." "And what have they learned?" Evangeline asked. "That love doesn't respect the boundaries we try to build around it. That good people come in all sizes and colors. That sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the strongest results." Midnight approached, and the last guests finally departed. Evangeline and Goliath found themselves alone in their home, truly their home now, shared in marriage as well as mutual affection. So Evangeline said, settling beside him on the sofa, in front of the fireplace, "How does it feel to be a married man?" "Like I've been waiting my whole life for this moment without knowing it," Goliath replied, wrapping his arms around her. "How does it feel to be married to a former slave who's taller than most trees?" "Like I've finally found someone strong, enough to be my equal," she said, nestling against his chest. "Like I've found my home." Outside, snow began to fall again, not the deadly blizzard that had brought them together, but the gentle, steady snowfall of a Colorado winter settling in for the long haul. Inside, by the warmth of their fire, two people who had saved each other's lives began planning the rest of their lives together. They would face challenges, certainly. There would be business decisions to make, social barriers to navigate, and the simple daily work of building a marriage between two strong-willed people from different worlds. But they would face it all together, as partners in every sense of the word. 6 months later, Stoneheart Mining Consortium would become one of the most successful operations in 3 territories. known as much for its fair treatment of workers. As for its profitability, a year after that, the Stoneheart School would open its doors to children of all races and backgrounds, with Goliath himself serving as its first headmaster. But all of that lay in the future. Tonight, as the snow fell softly outside their windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Evangeline and Goliath Stoneheart simply held each other close and marveled at the incredible journey that had brought them from a deadly blizzard to a love that would last the rest of their lives. "No regrets?" Goliath asked, echoing the question from their first days together. "Only that we didn't find each other sooner," Evangeline replied, tilting her face up for another kiss. "But I suppose we found each other exactly when we were supposed to. In the middle of a blizzard, when we both needed saving the most, and discovered that sometimes the best way to save yourself is to save someone else first." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them of the storm that had changed their lives forever. But inside, surrounded by warmth and love and the promise of shared tomorrows, Mr. and Mrs. Stoneheart began the greatest adventure of all, building a life together that would prove to the world that true love recognizes no boundaries, respects no prejudices, and creates its own definition of what's possible when two hearts decide to beat as one.